So we're gonna mention them again in the cellular respiration. All right, let's keep going. Now, those are electron carriers. So in those redox reactions, you have the electrons, being passed between molecules. And another thing that you're going to see a lot is energy generation. Okay, so there's going to be energy invested or energy gain. Okay, so one molecule that we'll have to use as a temporary storage for energy is ATP. So we mentioned this briefly when we talk about nucleic acid molecules in the biomolecule chapter. I don't know if you remember. So the full name for ATP, adenosine triphosphate. Okay, so adenosine triphosphate. Okay, now just real quick review of terms. So if you remember, nucleic acids are big biomolecules consist of their subunits, which is nucleotide. Right? The subunit is a nucleotide, and the nucleotide has three components. The first one, this is nitrogenous base because it contains nitrogen, nitrogenous base. And then the second component is a 5-carbon sugar. It's a pentose. So pentose. Remember, this means 5 and OIC sugar. And then the last component for nucleotide is usually phosphate group. Okay, so phosphate group. So it could be 1, that would be monophosphate, 2, diphosphate, 3, that means triphosphate. Okay, so you have this last component, that's phosphate group. Okay, now adenosine. So if you just look at the nitrogen base, it's called adenine. It just refers to the base. But if you look at the base plus the pentose sugar, that's called adenosine. All right, so adenosine triphosphate, that means you have adenosine, which includes the base over here, and then the sugar. And then you have 3 phosphate groups attached to it. All right, so that's ATP. Now, ATP can hydrolyze. If you remember what hydrolyze means, that means you're providing a water molecule to help break down a larger molecule. So ATP can hydrolyze with the help of water, and it breaks down into one inorganic phosphate and then ADP, right? Because now there are only 2 phosphate groups left, so it's diphosphate, so ADP. And in that process, energy will be released because in these chemical bonds, this bond right here, this bond right here, there's a lot of energy stored. And then this bond right here, that one has the highest energy. Okay, so when the ATP hydrolyzes and this bond is being broken down, there's a lot of energy released. Okay, so this is how ATP acts or serves as the energy currency and provides energy for cellular activities. Okay, now you can go the other direction, which means you have a phosphate group and you have ADP, right? And if you can provide energy, so for example, maybe you break down glucose. Remember, when you break down the chemical bonds in glucose, energy is released, right? And then the cell can harvest that energy, can capture that energy, and then use this energy and then the raw material and make ATP. Okay, ATP. So that's kind of equivalent to recharge your battery, right? So you're putting energy back into the battery, which is ATP. So it's like you're recharging the battery. So from ATP to ADP, this is very important. So that's why I'm spending so much time in here. From ATP to ADP, energy is released. So I'm just going to do big E for energy, released. So that's equivalent to when you're using your battery to power something. Okay? You're using battery to power your phone, power your computer. If you go the other direction, when you use ADP and the phosphate, and then use the energy that you capture from breaking down something to make ATP, energy is stored in ATP for future use. So this is the equivalent to you recharging the battery for later use, right? You can recharge the computer battery, but you're not using it. And then when you go somewhere else, let's say you can't plug it in, you can just use the energy that's stored in the battery. Oops, here. Okay, now here is a question. This is kind of related to what we covered in the cell communication chapter. So the reaction from ADP to ATP, ADP to ATP, so this chemical reaction right here, is that a phosphorylation or dephosphorylation? So I'll give you 2 seconds to think about it. Okay, so you can see ADP to ATP, you have to attach a phosphate ion to ADP, right? So you're adding phosphate. So that's going to be phosphorylation, all right? And then from ATP to ADP over here, you are detaching. You're removing phosphate from ATP, right? Which generates ADP. So that's going to be dephosphorylation, all right? So ADP to ATP, the answer is this one. And then from ATP to ADP, that's going to be dephosphorylation. Oh, it's right here. It's this blank. Okay. All right, let's move on. Here, let's see. We mentioned this a little bit. This is just some more details. So let's see. Let me just skip this, and then we can come back if we need to. All right. Okay, cellular respiration. So this process is really critical to the survival of all the cells and your body as a whole, okay? Because all the cells, every single cell requires energy, okay? It's like your car, right? When you move your car, you have to put in energy, and that energy comes from gasoline. So all the cells, in order to survive and function normally, they also require energy. So they need to be powered. Okay, so how do we provide the energy? Where does the energy come from? It keeps moving. So it comes from the breakdown of those macromolecules that we talked about before. So mostly it's glucose and maybe some other carbohydrates. So they're the main fuel that our cells use for energy source. Okay. Now, of course, we can break down some other molecules like fats and proteins to obtain energy. That's also possible. But usually, your first choice will be glucose. Okay. So what happens is when you eat food, your food, all those biomolecules or carbohydrates are broken down to glucose. Okay. So glucose is absorbed from your intestines. Okay. So let's say this is the glucose. It gets absorbed through your intestine, small intestine, and then it goes into your bloodstream. And it's going to be transported and then delivered by the blood to all the cells in your body. Okay? So let's say it's delivered to some cells over here. So this is blood, and it contains glucose. The glucose will diffuse out of your blood and gets into the extracellular space of these cells, okay? So now what's going to happen? The cell is going to try to, let's say this is the cell. The cell is going to take in glucose through cellular transport. We talk about that, okay? So usually it's either facilitated transport or could be some special form of active transport. So glucose moves into the cell, and then the cell uses mitochondria to break down glucose. Okay, break down glucose, and that releases energy, and that energy is stored in ATP for future use. Okay, so that's the big picture. And then this is the general chemical reaction for cellular respiration. So we provide sugar, which is glucose. And in that process, energy is required. Not energy, oxygen is required. Okay, so you have to provide oxygen to kind of almost like a burn glucose. Okay, and then in that process, energy is stored in ATP, and you also generate carbon dioxide, which you exhale to get rid of, and then water. Okay, so think of this process as when you go camping, you burn wood. It's very similar to that. It happens inside your individual cells, and the cells are burning wood, which is glucose, to get energy, okay, or heat. All right. Okay. Just want to mention real quick. You guys probably talk about this in the lab. So in this chemical reaction, sugar and oxygen, they're reactants, right? So that's the molecules that are going to undergo the chemical reaction. And then on the other side of the arrow, these are the products, right? That's what are generated at the end of the chemical reaction. Okay, next slide. So Wilder mentioned this, the chemical reaction, and it's basically you're burning glucose in oxygen. So you're using oxygen to burn glucose. Okay.